The storm arrived without warning, the kind of storm the old fishermen would later swear had been sent by the sea itself. Lightning split the sky over the eastern coast of the kingdom, and thunder rolled across the cliffs like war drums. In the chaos of wind and rain, a strange vessel broke apart against the rocks, its dark timber and unfamiliar carvings unlike anything the coastal soldiers had ever seen. When the soldiers reached the wreckage with torches hissing against the rain, they found her standing alone amid the debris. A woman, tall and unyielding, her dark skin gleaming under the storm light, her clothing torn but her posture unbroken. She held no weapon, yet something in her stillness made even hardened soldiers hesitate. The captain of the coastal guard raised his sword and ordered her to kneel. She did not move. He ordered his men to seize her. What followed would be spoken of in taverns and temples for years to come. She did not kill a single man. She did not need to. Within minutes, nearly 30 soldiers lay groaning in the mud, disarmed, their pride broken more than their bodies. She had fought with a control that unsettled everyone who witnessed it, striking only enough to end each fight, never enough to end a life. It was that restraint, more than her strength, that convinced the villagers she was something beyond human. By dawn, word had spread through every rice paddy and mountain path. A demon had washed ashore, a curse from the sea. The gods themselves must have turned their backs on the kingdom to allow such a creature to walk among them. She was bound in heavy iron chains and dragged toward the capital, a journey of 2 days through villages that emptied at the sound of the approaching guard. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Old men spat at the ground and murmured prayers. Someone threw a stone that struck her shoulder, and still she did not lower her head. Her eyes, dark and unflinching, moved across the crowds like she was memorizing every face that condemned her, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. If this story is keeping you hooked, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let's continue. When she finally passed through the capital's towering gates, the whole city had gathered. Word of the cursed woman had outrun the soldiers escorting her. Stalls closed. Children were pulled onto rooftops for a better view. Priests burned incense and chanted protective verses as she passed, as though her very presence might poison the air. From the high balcony of the royal palace, Crown Prince Hwan Seojin watched the procession below with narrowed eyes. He had heard the reports from the coast, 30 soldiers defeated without a single death, and something about that detail had troubled him since the moment it reached his desk. A true monster would have left corpses in her wake. This woman had left something else: restraint, discipline, the mark of a warrior, not a demon. When she was finally dragged into the courtyard below his balcony, chains scraping against stone, she lifted her head and looked directly up at him. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have, their eyes met across the distance. There was no pleading in her gaze, no fear, only a fierce, weary defiance, the look of someone who had already decided she would not beg for her life, even if it meant losing it. Something in the crown prince's chest shifted, quiet and unexplainable, like a door he had not known existed creaking open for the first time. The queen dowager did not share his hesitation. Seo Hyejin, mother to the king and grandmother to the throne's future, stood at the edge of the courtyard with her council of ministers, her painted lips pressed into a thin line of certainty. "Execute her before nightfall," she commanded. "Let the kingdom see that we do not tolerate demons within our borders." The ministers murmured their agreement. Minister Choi Diho, ever eager to please the throne while serving interests of his own, was the loudest among them. insisting that mercy shown to a foreign spy would be read as weakness by every rival kingdom watching. The execution order was drawn and sealed before the sun reached its highest point. It was then that the crown prince descended from the balcony, crossing the courtyard with a calm that silenced every whispering noble in his path. He stopped before the executioner's platform, between the kneeling prisoner and the blade meant to end her life. "No one will touch her," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned courtyard. The kingdom fell utterly silent. Even the Queen Dowager, a woman rarely at a loss for words, stared at her grandson as though he had spoken in a language she did not recognize. No one, not the ministers, not the guards, not the frightened crowd pressed against the courtyard walls, understood why the heir to the throne had chosen, in that single moment, to place himself between his own kingdom and its judgment. But something had already begun. Something that would, before the year's end, reshape two kingdoms divided by an ocean and centuries of silence. The palace that Crown Prince Siajin called home was a place of gleaming tiled roofs curved like the wings of cranes, courtyards lined with ancient pine, and halls where every whispered word carried the weight of political consequence. Siajin had grown up within these walls, understanding that every smile hid a calculation, every alliance a debt waiting to be called. His father, the king, was a man worn thin by decades of rule, increasingly content to let his mother, the Queen Dowager, manage the affairs of court. It was an arrangement that suited Hyojin perfectly. She had spent her life ensuring that the bloodline she had married into would never lose its grip on power, and she viewed the strange woman from the sea as nothing more than an unpredictable variable threatening the order she had spent decades constructing. Siajin had been raised alongside Lady Han Yaren, the daughter of a powerful noble family, promised to him since childhood in a match designed to secure alliances rather than affection. Yaren was elegant, sharp-witted, and fiercely ambitious, having spent her entire life preparing to become queen. She loved Siajin in her own way, though it was a love tangled inseparably with ambition, and she had never questioned that their marriage was simply a matter of time. General Kang Minyi commanded the royal army with the discipline of a man who trusted strategy over sentiment. He had seen the reports from the coast personally and had ridden out to examine the wreckage himself before the woman was ever dragged into the capital. What he found troubled him far more than any curse. The techniques used to disarm his soldiers were unlike anything practiced in the kingdom's martial schools. Precise, economical, devastatingly effective. Whoever she was, she had trained for years under a discipline as rigorous as his own. When the crown prince halted the execution, it was Minyi who quietly suggested an alternative to the furious council. Imprison her. Question her. If she truly meant harm, better to understand the threat than to create a martyr the sea itself seemed to have delivered. Reluctantly, the king agreed, more out of exhaustion than conviction. The execution order was stayed. The woman was thrown into the deepest cell beneath the palace instead, chained to stone walls that had not held a prisoner in over a decade. Word of the crown prince's decision rippled through every noble household by nightfall. Some called it foolish. Others called it dangerous. Lady Yaren called it curious, watching her betrothed with new and careful attention, sensing something shifting beneath his usually composed exterior. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath in the days that followed. Servants spoke in hushed tones as they carried trays through corridors lined with painted screens depicting cranes and mountains, glancing nervously toward the lower levels where the prisoner was kept. Guards assigned to her cell requested reassignment, citing dreams of drowning and voices carried on the wind. Even the palace cats, usually indifferent to the affairs of humans, were said to avoid the corridor leading to the dungeon stairs. Siajin found the superstition exhausting in ways he had never noticed before her arrival. He had grown up accepting the kingdom's traditions without question. The incense burned before every council meeting, the fortune tellers consulted before any major decision, the belief that misfortune always required a cause beyond simple chance. Watching an entire court construct an elaborate mythology around one frightened, chained woman revealed to him, for the first time, how easily fear could masquerade as wisdom. In the villages, the fear did not fade. If anything, it deepened. Within days, a sudden blight withered half of a harvest in the eastern fields. A herd of cattle in a nearby village dropped dead overnight with no visible cause. A second storm, smaller but violent, tore through fishing boats along the coast. Villagers whispered that the curse had not been contained by chains. It had been unleashed the moment she was allowed to live. Across the eastern sea, in the kingdom she called home, none of this was yet known. Kitala's royal compound rose along cliffs overlooking waters far calmer than the storm that had claimed her ship. Its towers built from sun-baked clay and reinforced with dark timber, adorned with carved patterns representing the lineage of warriors who had defended its shores for centuries. Drums announced the hour there instead of bells, and its people measured the changing seasons not by cherry blossoms, but by the migration of great birds that nested along its coastline each year. Zuri's absence had already been noticed. Her mother, a respected elder among the compound's council, had begun demanding answers from the kingdom's own navigators, refusing to believe her daughter had simply vanished into the sea without a trace. Minister Choi used every incident to fuel the court's fear, standing before the king with dramatic accounts of ruin and warnings of divine punishment. He argued daily for her execution, framing every misfortune in the kingdom as further proof of the danger the crown prince had invited into their midst. What no one in the court yet understood was that Minister Choi's concern had little to do with curses or gods. His fortune depended on tensions remaining high, on fear directing the court's decisions rather than reason. A frightened kingdom was an obedient kingdom, and an obedient kingdom was far easier for a corrupt minister to exploit. Deep in her cell, chained to cold stone, Zuri Ademi understood none of the whispered accusations swirling above her, not in words, but she understood fear when she saw it, and she recognized the particular cruelty of people who blamed the powerless for misfortunes beyond anyone's control. She spent her nights in that cell clutching a pendant hidden beneath the remains of her torn tunic, a golden emblem shaped like a rising sun crowned with intertwined blades, the crest of her homeland, Kitala. It had been given to her before she ever set foot on the ship that brought her to these unfamiliar shores, and it was the only piece of home the storm had not taken from her. She remembered the compound where she had trained since childhood, its high walls carved with the histories of warriors who came before her, its courtyards filled each morning with the rhythm of drums calling students to practice before the sun had fully risen. She remembered her mother's voice, stern but warm, reminding her that a warrior's true strength lay in knowing when restraint mattered more than victory. She remembered the festival lights strung between the compound's towers during the harvest celebrations, the smell of spiced grain roasting over open fires, the songs passed down through generations that told of ancestors who had crossed vast distances in service of their people. None of it felt real anymore, chained in a stone cell beneath a kingdom that had already decided what she was before she ever spoke a word. She thought of her companions, the small crew who had sailed with her across an ocean. No one in her kingdom had crossed in generations, and grief settled over her like the chains around her wrists. She did not know if any of them had survived the wreck. She did not know if she would survive what came next. But she refused, absolutely refused, to let the fear in the eyes of her captors convince her that she was the monster they believed her to be. When scholars were brought to question her, she remained silent, not out of defiance alone, but because their language was a wall she could not yet climb. She watched their mouths shape unfamiliar sounds, studied the rhythm of their speech, and said nothing, waiting, always watching, always calculating her next move the way she had been trained to since she was a child learning to fight before she had learned to read. It was on the 4th night of her imprisonment that the crown prince came to her cell alone, without guards, without ceremony, carrying only a single lantern and a folded cloth containing rice and dried fish. She watched him descend the stairs with the same wary stillness she had shown the executioner, expecting another interrogation, another attempt to break her silence through threats rather than questions. Instead, he simply set the food within her reach and sat on the stone floor across from her cell, close enough to speak, far enough to respect the iron bars between them. He did not ask her anything that first night. He simply sat, occasionally speaking a few words in his language, pointing to objects around the cell, waiting to see if she would repeat them. She did not that night, but she watched him with an intensity that told him she was listening far more closely than she let on. He returned the following night, and the night after that. It became a quiet ritual neither of them spoke of to anyone else. He would bring food, sit across from her, and slowly, patiently, begin building a bridge between two languages that had never once touched before that storm. He drew pictures in the dust of the cell floor. He pointed to the lantern and said its name. He pointed to her and waited. On the 7th night, she finally spoke, repeating the word for lantern back to him with careful precision. It was such a small thing, and yet Siajin felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest at the sound of her voice finally breaking its silence for him. From there, the words came slowly but steadily. She learned faster than he expected, her mind sharp and hungry for understanding. And in turn, she began teaching him fragments of her own language, strange and musical words that felt foreign on his tongue, but that he found himself practicing long after he left her cell each night. Weeks passed this way, the two of them building understanding one word at a time in the flickering light of a single lantern, hidden from a court that would have condemned them both for the simple act of speaking to one another as equals. It was during one of these quiet nights that she finally revealed a fragment of the truth she had carried since the wreck. Using the limited words they now shared between them, and gestures to fill the gaps, she told him she was not a spy, not a demon, not a curse sent by any sea god. She was a warrior of Kitala, sent across the ocean on a mission that had cost her ship, her crew, and very nearly her life. She spoke of a sacred relic, stolen from her kingdom generations ago, its loss still spoken of with grief and outrage by her people. She had been chosen, along with her crew, to follow ancient maps rumored to lead toward wherever the relic had vanished to. The storm had ended that mission before it truly began. Siajin listened with growing fascination, and something else he did not yet have a name for. He had spent his entire life surrounded by nobles who spoke in riddles and half-truths, calculating every word for political advantage. Here, chained in a cell with nothing left to gain from deception, this woman spoke to him with a bluntness he had never before experienced. She, in turn, found herself studying him just as closely. She had expected the heir of this fearful, superstition-soaked kingdom to be as small-minded as the courtiers who had condemned her without a single question. Instead, she found a man who listened more than he spoke, who asked questions rather than assuming answers, whose eyes held none of the disgust she saw in everyone else who looked at her. There were nights when their lessons stalled entirely, replaced instead by long stretches of comfortable silence, the kind that only grows between two people who have stopped performing for one another. Siajin found himself lingering in the dungeon corridor long after their lessons ended, reluctant to climb back toward a palace that suddenly felt colder and more hollow than the stone cell he had just left. Zuri, for her part, began listening for the particular rhythm of his footsteps on the stairs, a small and involuntary comfort she was reluctant to admit even to herself. "You have never left this palace, have you?" she said to him one night, her words halting but clear enough to carry the weight of amusement and something sharper beneath it. "I have traveled with my father to the border fortresses," Siajin replied, a little defensively. "That is not the same as leaving," she said. "You have been protected your entire life, wrapped in silk and guarded by soldiers. You do not know what it means to survive on nothing but your own strength." Her words stung more than he expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had never once, in 25 years, faced a moment where his survival depended entirely on himself. "Then teach me," he said quietly, surprising them both. It began the next night, in secret, in the smallest hour before dawn. She taught him, through the bars of her cell at first, and then, once he found reason enough to have her chains briefly loosened under careful guard, through demonstration. Stances built for economy of movement rather than display. Strikes designed to end conflict rather than prolong it. A philosophy of combat entirely different from the rigid forms he had been drilled in since childhood. In turn, he told her about his own life, the weight of expectation that had followed him since birth, the mother he barely remembered, the father whose approval always seemed to hover just out of reach, the marriage arranged for him before he was old enough to understand what marriage meant. He told her about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who bowed to him, but never truly saw him. There were lighter moments, too, stolen between the weight of politics and grief. One night, attempting to demonstrate a Kitala greeting that involved pressing forearms together as a sign of respect between warriors, Siajin fumbled the motion so badly he nearly toppled into the bars separating them, and Zuri had to bite back the sound rising in her throat. Another evening, she attempted to repeat a formal court phrase he had taught her, mangling the pronunciation so thoroughly that even the stone-faced guard stationed nearby had to turn away to hide his amusement. These small failures, shared without judgment, did more to close the distance between them than any grand gesture could have managed. For the first time since the storm had taken everything from her, Zuri laughed. It was a small sound, quiet and almost startled out of her, but it was real, and Siajin found himself treasuring it more than any victory he had ever won on a training field. Their growing bond did not go unnoticed for long. An assassination attempt in the depths of the palace dungeon shattered whatever fragile secrecy they had maintained. Hired blades, sent by someone within the court, desperate to remove the growing threat she represented to their ambitions, slipped past the outer guards one moonless night while Siajin was present. Zuri could have escaped in the chaos that followed. Her chains had been loosened for training, and the assassin's attention was divided the moment steel met steel. Instead, she threw herself between the blades and the crown prince, disarming one attacker and breaking the arm of another before the palace guards finally arrived to finish what she had started. She had every reason to run. She chose, instead, to protect the one person in this hostile kingdom who had shown her a flicker of humanity. Siajin stared at her afterward, breathless, his own sword still drawn and trembling slightly in his grip, and understood with sudden and terrifying clarity that whatever was growing between them had already moved beyond his control. "Why?" he asked her, once the guards had cleared the corridor and left them alone amid the wreckage of the attack. "You could have escaped." "And go where?" she answered simply. "Across an ocean alone with no ship and no crew. No, I protect what matters to me, even here." It was the closest either of them had come to admitting what had grown quietly between them in those stolen hours, by lantern light. News of a bandit raid on a village near the eastern border reached the palace only days later, and it was Zuri who first heard the panicked report delivered to the king's council, understanding enough of the language now to grasp the danger described. The royal garrison stationed nearby had been decimated in an ambush, and without immediate reinforcement, the village faced slaughter. She requested, through Siajin, permission to fight. The Queen Dowager's refusal was immediate and absolute. Arming the cursed woman, even for the sake of defending a village, was unthinkable to her. But Siajin, for the first time in his life, pressed his father directly, arguing that the kingdom could not afford to lose more soldiers to pride when a solution stood chained in their own dungeon. The king, weary of the endless court disputes and genuinely alarmed by the threat to the border village, made the decision that would change everything. He granted Zuri a single sword and a single chance. She rode out with General Minyi's remaining forces before the sun had fully risen, still bearing faint bruises from her chains, her wrists raw where iron had rubbed skin thin. Minyi watched her with sharp, assessing eyes throughout the ride, still uncertain whether he was witnessing salvation or catastrophe. What followed at the village became legend within days. Zuri moved through the bandit ranks like water through stone, precise, relentless, utterly without hesitation. She protected fleeing villagers with the same fierce discipline she had once used to protect the very prince who had spared her life. When a young mother stumbled while carrying her child, Zuri intercepted the blade meant for both of them, taking the blow across her own forearm rather than let it reach the woman behind her. By the time the bandits scattered, broken and fleeing into the surrounding hills, the village that had watched her arrival with terrified suspicion now watched her walk among the wounded with something entirely different in their eyes. A child, no older than 5, separated from his frightened mother in the chaos, ran not away from the woman covered in blood and dust, but directly into her arms, burying his face against her shoulder and sobbing with relief. Zuri knelt in the mud and held him gently, murmuring words he could not understand, but that clearly carried comfort, until his mother finally found them both. The soldiers who witnessed it would tell the story for years afterward, embellishing it slightly each time, but the core of it never changed. The cursed woman from the sea had knelt in the dirt of a border village and comforted a frightened child as though he were her own. The village elder, an old woman who had lost her husband to a bandit raid years earlier, approached Zuri as the wounded were being carried to shelter and pressed a woven bracelet into her palm, a token usually reserved for family members returning safely from war. Zuri accepted it with a solemnity that surprised the soldiers watching, understanding instinctively the weight of the gesture, even without full command of the language surrounding it. General Minyi approached her afterward, his expression unreadable, and offered her water from his own canteen, a small gesture that carried far more weight than either of them acknowledged aloud. It was the first time since her capture that anyone of rank had treated her as something other than a threat to be managed. "You fight with discipline," he said, once Siajin had translated. "Where did you learn such control?" "My kingdom does not celebrate warriors who kill without necessity," she answered. "Strength without restraint is simply violence. My people were taught the difference before we were taught to hold a blade." Minyi said nothing further, but something in his stance shifted, respect settling quietly where suspicion had once stood guard. News of the battle spread through the capital faster than any royal decree could have managed. The villagers who had once thrown stones at her chains now spoke of a guardian sent by the sea rather than a curse born from it. Not everyone's fear dissolved so easily. Old superstitions rarely surrender without a fight, but the tide had begun, undeniably, to turn. It was Lady Han Yeren who watched this shifting tide with the sharpest and most dangerous attention. She had noticed, long before the border village incident, the changes in her betrothed, the distracted way he answered her questions. The late nights he claimed were spent reviewing military reports. The look in his eyes whenever the cursed woman's name arose in court conversation. A look Yeren recognized immediately because she had once hoped to see it directed at herself. Jealousy, sharp and consuming, began to take root in her, and unlike the villagers whose fear was slowly softening into gratitude, Yeren's resentment only sharpened with each passing week. The midpoint of this unraveling arrived through an unlikely source: the dust-choked archives buried beneath the palace, where centuries of forgotten records were kept sealed away from all but the most persistent scholars. A young archivist, tasked by General Minyi with researching any historical contact between the kingdom and lands across the Eastern Sea, uncovered something that should never have been forgotten. Decades earlier, long before Siajin's birth, a Korean envoy had secretly sailed to the shores of Kitala, seeking trade and alliance with the powerful kingdom rumored to exist beyond the horizon. The expedition had ended in disaster, though the official records claimed it had simply been lost at sea. Buried deeper still, in a ledger nearly consumed by mold and time, was a single damning entry, an inventory of goods brought back from that expedition, including an item described only as a golden relic of significant spiritual value, taken from the royal compound of Kitala without permission or trade. The relic Zuri had crossed an ocean to recover had not vanished into myth. It had been stolen by her ancestors' own trading partners and hidden away in this very kingdom for generations, its existence buried beneath decades of deliberate silence. Minister Choi discovered the archivist's findings before the report ever reached the king, and in a moment of panic that would ultimately unravel his entire scheme, he burned a portion of the evidence, hoping to erase the connection between his own family's rise to prominence and the theft that had funded it generations ago. He did not burn enough. The surviving fragments, smuggled to Siajin by the terrified young archivist who understood he had uncovered something dangerous, revealed enough to confirm what Zuri had suspected, but never been able to prove. The tension building between the two kingdoms, the growing rumors of coming conflict, the very reason her mission had been deemed necessary in the first place, none of it had been inevitable. Someone within the palace had spent years quietly ensuring that peace between the two kingdoms remained impossible, manipulating fear and prejudice for their own private gain. The coming war, Siajin realized with cold dread, had been planned. He brought the fragments to Zuri that same night, translating what he could with hands that trembled slightly from the weight of what he now understood. She listened in silence, her jaw tight, years of grief and confusion finally finding an explanation that made a terrible, deliberate kind of sense. "Your people did not simply forget mine," she said quietly. "Someone made certain of it." "I will find who is responsible," Siajin promised, "whatever it costs." She looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and grateful passing behind her eyes. "Then we will find them together." The archivist's discovery did more than expose a conspiracy. It gave Zuri something she had not realized she was missing since the storm first tore her from everything familiar. Proof that her mission had mattered, that the relic she sought was not a myth chased in vain, but a truth buried deliberately by men who feared what its return might cost them. She spent long hours afterward studying the recovered fragments herself, tracing the faded ink with careful fingers, piecing together decades of silence one damaged page at a time. Siajin, in turn, found himself questioning everything he had once accepted without thought. If his own kingdom's court had been capable of burying such a betrayal for the sake of profit and fear, what else had been hidden behind the palace's gleaming tiled roofs and carefully rehearsed ceremonies? He began attending council sessions with a new wariness, listening for the gaps between what was said and what was left carefully unspoken. In the weeks that followed, the boundary between duty and desire grew impossible for either of them to ignore any longer. Zuri, no longer confined to a cell, but housed instead under careful guard within the palace grounds, began training openly with select soldiers under General Minyi's supervision, her presence slowly becoming less of a scandal and more of an accepted, if unusual, fixture of palace life. Siajin found reasons, more often than strictly necessary, to observe these training sessions himself. One evening, beneath a canopy of blossoming trees in the palace's private garden, Zuri returned from training with a shallow wound across her shoulder, the result of a training blade catching her off guard during a particularly demanding session. Siajin insisted on tending to it himself, dismissing the attending physician with a firmness that surprised even him. He knelt beside her in the fading light, carefully cleaning and bandaging the wound with hands that had never before performed such an intimate task for anyone. She watched him work in silence, studying the concentration on his face, the gentleness that contradicted everything the court believed about his cold, disciplined nature. "You are careful," she observed softly. "I do not wish to cause you further pain," he replied, not looking up from his work. "You have endured enough of that already." When he finished, their eyes met in the lantern light filtering through the blossoms above them, and neither moved away. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and touched his hand where it still rested near her bandaged shoulder. It was such a small gesture, and yet it carried the weight of everything neither of them had dared to say aloud. "I did not expect this," she whispered. "Not here, not with you." "Neither did I," Siogen admitted. "But I would not undo it, even if I could." He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. And when she did not, their first kiss beneath the blossoming trees felt like the quiet culmination of every stolen conversation, every shared danger, every wall that had crumbled between them since the night he first brought her food in a cold, unforgiving cell. It lasted only a moment before the sound of approaching footsteps forced them apart, royal guards making their evening rounds through the garden paths. But it was not only guards who witnessed that fleeting, tender moment. Hidden behind a lattice screen at the garden's edge, Lady Han Yeren watched the kiss with an expression that shifted rapidly from disbelief to fury to a cold, calculating resolve. She had suspected. Now she had confirmation. She retreated to her family's quarters within the palace that night and sat before her mirror for a long while, studying the reflection of a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for a throne that now seemed to be slipping from her grasp, not through any political maneuvering, but through something far more difficult to fight: genuine affection freely given rather than arranged. She thought of the years spent perfecting her calligraphy, her court etiquette, her understanding of trade agreements and succession law, all in service of a future she had never once questioned until now. The unfairness of it settled into something colder and more determined than simple heartbreak. She left the garden without a sound, her mind already turning toward revenge. It did not take her long to act. Within days, Yeren approached the Queen Dowager with carefully chosen words, framing what she had witnessed not as a simple indiscretion, but as clear evidence of the cursed woman's supposed manipulation over the future king. She suggested, with practiced subtlety, that perhaps the strange misfortunes plaguing the kingdom since Zuri's arrival were not curses at all, but deliberate sabotage, carried out to weaken the throne from within. The Queen Dowager, already deeply suspicious and searching for any justification to remove Zuri permanently, seized upon Yeren's account eagerly. Together, they began weaving a case designed to convince the king that his son had been bewitched, manipulated by a foreign spy sent specifically to seduce and destabilize the royal line. Minister Choi, desperate to redirect attention away from the burned archive evidence that still threatened to expose him, eagerly amplified their accusations, presenting forged correspondence suggesting Zuri had been secretly signaling her homeland throughout her imprisonment, calling for an invasion timed to coincide with her growing influence over the crown prince. It was a masterwork of deception, and it worked with devastating speed. Before Siogen fully understood what was happening, the court had turned against Zuri with a ferocity even greater than her initial capture. Guards, previously assigned to protect her, were now ordered to confine her once again. The king, exhausted and increasingly convinced by the mounting evidence presented before him, authorized her arrest on charges of espionage and treason. Worse still, word arrived from the coast that a massive fleet had been sighted approaching from the eastern horizon, bearing the unmistakable colors and banners of Kitala. The kingdom she had crossed an ocean to serve had come looking for her, and in the absence of any explanation for her prolonged silence, they believed the worst. They believed she had betrayed her homeland, allied herself with the very kingdom that had once stolen from them, and abandoned her mission entirely. Both kingdoms now stood convinced of the same impossible lie, orchestrated so perfectly that even Zuri, chained once more within palace walls, struggled to see a path through the chaos closing in around her. Siajin found her in her cell, guards this time under Yaren's careful arrangement stationed close enough to overhear every word exchanged. "They believe I betrayed everyone," Zuri said quietly, her voice hollow with a grief deeper than fear. "My people think I chose you and your kingdom over my own. Your people think I lured an invasion to destroy you. There is no truth that will satisfy either side now." "Then we will make our own truth," Siajin said, kneeling before her cell despite the watching guards. "I do not care what the court believes. I do not care what my grandmother whispers into my father's ear. I know who you are, and I will not abandon you to a lie built by cowards protecting their own guilt." "They will call you a traitor," she warned him. "Then I shall be a traitor beside you," he answered, rather than a prince who stood silent while injustice wore a crown. When the moment finally came, standing before the assembled court and the terrified eyes of nobles who had already condemned her in their minds, Siajin made his declaration with a clarity that silenced every whisper in the throne room. "If she is my enemy," he said, his voice steady despite his mother's fury blazing beside the throne, "then I shall stand beside my enemy, for I have seen more honor in her chains than in every crown this court has ever worn." The court erupted, some in outrage, some in stunned disbelief, but Siajin did not waver, and for the first time since her capture, Zuri felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel amid the chaos consuming both kingdoms: hope. The fleet from Kitala made landfall within days, war drums echoing across the coastline where Zuri had first washed ashore months earlier. The commander of the fleet, a fierce and weathered warrior named for the storms she had survived in her own right, demanded the immediate return of Zuri Ademi, believing her either captured against her will or, worse, turned traitor to her own people. The royal court, meanwhile, prepared its own defenses, General Minyi mobilizing what forces remained despite deep and growing doubts about the true nature of the threat they now faced. It was Minyi, in fact, who first voiced what many suspected but few dared to say aloud. "This does not feel like an invasion planned by a traitor," he said quietly to Siajin as they surveyed the approaching ships from the fortress walls. "It feels like a misunderstanding, weaponized by someone eager to see both kingdoms destroy each other." Siajin nodded grimly. Minister Choi. Confronting, Choi directly proved unnecessary. Cornered by mounting suspicion, and the threat of the archive fragments finally reaching the king's full attention, Choi made a desperate final move, attempting to flee the capital under cover of the chaos surrounding the approaching fleet. He was intercepted at the mountain fortress guarding the kingdom's eastern approach, the very fortress where the final confrontation between both kingdoms now seemed destined to unfold. What followed was not merely a battle between two armies, but a reckoning years in the making. Siajin and Zuri, working together for the first time as true equals rather than prince and prisoner, moved through the chaos of the fortress with a coordination born from months of shared training and hard-won trust. She fought alongside soldiers who had once feared her shadow, now trusting her completely to guard their flank. He commanded strategy with a clarity sharpened by everything she had taught him about survival beyond the walls of privilege. Minister Choi, cornered at last within the fortress's inner chambers, revealed the full extent of his treachery under the weight of undeniable evidence, confessing to years of manipulation, forged correspondence, and the murder of a diplomat decades earlier, whose death had first poisoned relations between the two kingdoms beyond repair. He had orchestrated it all, generation after generation of careful, quiet sabotage, ensuring that peace remained forever just out of reach, while his family's fortune grew from the profits of perpetual, manufactured conflict. Zuri fought at the fortress gates alongside warriors from her own homeland, for the first time since the storm had separated her from everything she knew. And the reunion, brief as it was amid the chaos of battle, carried its own quiet joy. The Kitala commander who had once demanded her return as a suspected traitor now fought at her shoulder, her earlier fury replaced by grim respect once the truth of Choi's deception became clear. Together, warriors who had crossed an ocean to make war instead found themselves defending the same fortress walls against the true enemy hiding within. Siajin, meanwhile, coordinated the kingdom's own soldiers with a composure forged through months of training he had once considered beneath his station, directing defenses along the fortress's crumbling ramparts, while arrows and fire lit the night sky above them. He fought not as a sheltered prince protected by his title, but as a man who had finally learned what it meant to earn the trust of those beside him. The fighting that erupted around them as his confession echoed through the fortress halls was fierce and desperate. Soldiers from both kingdoms finally uniting against the true architect of their shared suffering, once the truth became undeniable to all who heard it. General Minyi, defending the fortress's collapsing eastern wall against a final desperate assault ordered by Choi's remaining loyalists, threw himself between a falling support beam and the crown prince, absorbing the blow that would have ended Siajin's life in his place. He died with the satisfaction of knowing the truth had finally surfaced, his final words a quiet acknowledgement to Siajin that the kingdom he had served his entire life was, at last, in worthy hands. Minister Choi did not survive the fortress's collapse, buried beneath the very stones that had hidden his crimes for so long. His schemes finally silenced along with the man who had woven them. In the aftermath, as dust settled over the mountain fortress and soldiers from both kingdoms stood side by side amid the wreckage of a war that should never have happened, peace finally became not just possible, but inevitable. The sacred relic, discovered hidden within the fortress's own vaults where Choi's family had kept it secured for generations, was recovered and returned to the commander of the Kitala fleet with full honors, and a formal apology delivered personally by the king himself. The king stood before both his own court and the assembled warriors of Kitala and acknowledged, publicly and without reservation, the grave injustice committed against Zuri Ademi from the moment she had washed ashore. He spoke of the fear that had blinded his kingdom to her honor, the prejudice that had nearly cost them a chance at genuine peace, and the courage of his own son in refusing to let that prejudice stand unchallenged. The villagers who had once thrown stones at her chains now knelt before her in the fortress courtyard, offering gratitude in place of fear. And Zuri, standing tall despite the exhaustion of battle still heavy in her limbs, found herself, for the first time since the storm had taken everything from her, truly welcomed rather than merely tolerated. The Queen Dowager, her schemes fully exposed alongside Yaren's role in amplifying Choi's lies, was stripped of her influence over the throne, retreating from court life entirely under the weight of a scandal she could no longer manipulate her way out of. Lady Han Yaren, disgraced and humiliated before the very court she had once hoped to rule, departed the capital quietly, her ambitions finally exceeded by the consequences of her own jealousy. It was in the quiet aftermath of the fortress, beneath a sky finally clearing after months of storm and shadow, that Siajin turned to Zuri and asked the question that had been building in his heart since the very first night he brought her food in a cold, unforgiving cell. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as a prisoner, not as a guest passing through. Stay as my equal, in every sense the word deserves." Zuri looked out toward the horizon where the ships of her homeland waited, then back at the man who had risked everything, his crown, his court, his own kingdom's fragile trust, to stand beside her when the entire world had called her a curse. "I crossed an ocean searching for something my people had lost," she said softly. "I did not expect to find something worth staying for instead." Months passed before the palace hosted a celebration, unlike anything the kingdom had ever witnessed. Silk banners in deep indigo and gold fluttered alongside vibrant fabrics woven in patterns that told stories of Kitala's history. The two traditions displayed side by side, rather than one overshadowing the other. Traditional court musicians blended their instruments with the powerful drums and voices carried across the sea by Kitala's own musicians, creating something entirely new from what had once been two separate worlds. Nobles who had once whispered of curses now stood beside warriors from Kitala who had once demanded war, all gathered together beneath banners representing a peace few had believed possible only a year before. Villagers who remembered throwing stones now brought offerings of gratitude instead, their fear long since transformed into genuine affection for the woman who had protected their homes and their children without ever asking for anything in return. Zuri walked through the palace gates that day wearing a gown that honored both her heritage and the kingdom that had, against every early expectation, become her home as well, gold and deep blue fabric flowing with the same quiet strength she had carried since the moment she first washed ashore. As the ceremony drew to its close, beneath a sky painted gold with the setting sun, those gathered could not help but reflect on how far both kingdoms had traveled to reach this single, unified moment. Fear had built walls between two peoples separated by more than an ocean. Love, patient and unyielding, had become the bridge that history itself had never managed to construct. Standing together at the edge of the palace grounds, overlooking the very sea that had once divided their worlds and now, at last, seemed only to connect them, Siajin and Zuri watched the horizon in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other something far greater than either kingdom had ever offered alone. Behind them, the sounds of celebration continued, two cultures finally woven into one. Children who had once hidden from Zuri now wove flower crowns to present to her as gifts, their earlier terror replaced by open, uncomplicated affection. Elders from Kitala shared stories of the storm goddess with palace scholars who had once dismissed such tales as foreign superstition, and the scholars, humbled by everything the past year had taught them, listened with genuine curiosity rather than condescension for the first time in the kingdom's long history. General Minyi's memory was honored that evening with a ceremony blending both traditions, his name spoken alongside a Kitala custom of releasing lanterns over water to guide the spirits of the fallen safely home. Zuri had insisted on this herself, remembering the man who had offered her water from his own canteen when no one else in the kingdom had shown her such simple decency. As the lanterns drifted out over the dark water, carrying his memory toward the horizon. Even the most hardened soldiers among the gathered crowd found themselves quietly moved. Ahead of the newly wedded couple stretched a horizon neither of them feared any longer, a future they intended to build together. One choice, one act of courage, one quiet moment of trust at a time. The curse the kingdom had once feared had, in the end, become the very thing that saved it, and the warrior once dragged through the streets in chains now stood beside its future king, not as a symbol of fear, but as proof that even the deepest divides could be crossed, if only someone was brave enough to take the first step. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who loves unforgettable love stories. And if you're passionate about powerful Afro-Korean romances filled with emotion, culture, and unexpected twists, hit the subscribe button and become part of our family. Click the next video on your screen and let another incredible journey begin. I'll see you there.